systems. Every time one of these waves hit them, the lights, come on, which is nice because then we actually see what's happening on the bridge.
I can see, guys, I can see.
Hi guys, Future64 here, and today we're talking about Picard Season 3, Episode 4, titled No Win Scenario, where you can call it the Kobayashi Maru if you want. If you're new here, the way that I do my reviews is I basically give my review as I'm breaking down the episode and share my thoughts and opinions as we walk through the episode, so definitely spoilers in this video. And I am a longtime Star Trek fan. I like particularly TNG and DS9, but I'm not a fan of New Trek. I don't like Discovery. I did not like the first couple seasons of Picard. However, here in Season 3, I am liking what we've gotten so far, 4 episodes in, and I gave it this other chance because of the new showrunner, Terry Matalas, and so far, this is the best of Star Trek I've seen since Star Trek Enterprise. But let's just go ahead and jump into the review. Before we get any further, I just want to refer to Rafi, who we all know is the worst. But she's not in this episode, which inherently makes this episode the best episode of the season, I think. Unfortunately, we don't get Worf either as a result. But regardless, I do think this is the best episode of the season so far. So we open up 5 years earlier than where we left the Titan sinking into the gravity well at the end of the last episode. 5 years earlier, a bunch of cadets come up to Picard and they're asking him about his encounter with the Hirogen, which I was like, oh, that's a nice little reference back to Voyager. Apparently, the Hirogen did make it to the Alpha Quadrant at some point, and Picard and Worf was specifically mentioned as a way of how they took down the Alpha for the Hirogen. The Hirogen actually evolved quite a bit over the course of Voyager, and I think the Hirogen were definitely one of the best things to come out of Voyager as far as new species. I always thought they were very interesting. They did evolve a lot, so I don't really know why they were still hunting exactly at this point, but regardless, it was nice to see the Hirogen mentioned just as a fan. And honestly, I just like the fact that these cadets like revere Picard. Like they're like, hey, here's this legend here, and this sits in stark contrast to how Picard was treated in the first and second season, particularly the first season.
Sheer hubris.
Where people just yelled at him all the time, didn't know who he was, and he just was belittled constantly. So it's nice to see, hey, these cadets know who he is. He's a legend. They want to hear his stories. And he specifically mentioned something that moves into something else, where he says, there will be a time when you will need to remember, no matter how bleak or unwinnable a situation, as long as you and your crew remain steadfast in your dedication to one another, you are never without hope. That line in particular is very much Star Trek. Star Trek is about a crew. The crew is an essential part of Star Trek. It's what makes Star Trek work. But this line sits in stark contrast to, because it immediately cuts to the Titan sinking into the gravity well, following one of the lines that I had a problem with, and I know some other people have had a problem with, where Riker blames Picard and says, Picard, you killed us all, remove yourself from the bridge. I understand why that line was used. It's up to each individual whether they buy that. I think less is more. I don't think it needed to be said. I don't think it made sense for him to say that. He is the captain. The decision rests with him, and he said it in front of the bridge crew. It was a problem for me at the end of the last episode. However, it is quickly addressed here in this episode, and I think that it is sufficiently answered, but I'll get into more of that here in a second. So Riker orders all available power be diverted to life support and the crew to gather in common areas to buy them some extra time, although it seems like it's pretty hopeless at this point. But then we get something that actually finally sheds some light onto the set. As a bioelectrical wave from the anomaly hits them, lights up the bridge, and I was like, man, it'd be nice if we just had some lights here. I've complained about this every episode, and I probably will complain about it every episode until the final episode. I just don't like how dark the set is, but there you go. I've said that, and there we go. Okay, moving on. So Riker goes to Picard, and Picard tries to apologize, but Riker stops him because Riker knows he was in the wrong. Picard may want to apologize and take responsibility for it, but Riker knows that he was in the wrong for saying that in front of his crew. And Riker gives Picard a status update on the ship and explains to Picard that he was right, that Riker was more hesitant to fight because of his current state of mind and being away from his family and still dealing with the death of his son. I'm not a fan of the fact that they killed off Riker's son, especially in the way that they did. And unfortunately, if you've seen season 1, you saw the dumb way in which they wrote that in. So, I'm not a fan of it, but, they're actually trying to flesh that out and make it more impactful and make it mean something here in this season. So I think that is something at least to be commended. You're basically taking a poorly written plot point from the first 2 seasons, which were straight garbage in my opinion, and actually trying to salvage bits of those plots and render them useful in some way. And Riker, says that he feels nothing after his son died, and Troy, who feels everything, couldn't live with the fact that Riker was not feeling anything, and Riker also couldn't live with Troy under those circumstances either. That's the reason why he ran away. And he the way that he's describing this definitely is he looked into the abyss, and blinked, is basically what this description is to me anyway. And he's kind of questioning the void of death and life after death, and he's really having like a spiritual crisis, I would say, after the death of his son. But he does recommend that Picard spend some time with his son with the little time that they have left. Then we get the title drop, which is, of course, no-win scenario. So Seven is searching for the changeling that they discovered in the last episode and comes across the dead transport officer who the changeling who took the place of, obviously before they left space dock, so you find that out. Riker, Seven goes to Riker, and Riker says, I could reinstate you, Seven, but in the unofficial capacity, you'd have a little bit more freedom to maneuver around and try and find this changeling. So I'm not going to reinstate you. See if you can find the changeling. And in sickbay, we see Crusher counting the energy pulses with Jack, and this is a reoccurring thing throughout the episode, and it is eventually revealed as to what she's doing and why that is later. Picard goes into sickbay and asks to speak to Jack because, of course, he wants to get to know Jack a little bit more, per Riker's advice, and really, as far as they're concerned, there's really no hope. They're in a no-win scenario.
Yeah, you keep telling me that.
Seven goes to see Shaw, and Shaw's response is, bang up job your heroes are doing with my ship. I like Shaw. I mentioned in my review of the second episode that the new characters are working. That includes Shaw and Jack. Both of them are great new characters. Every time new characters were introduced in season 1 and 2 of Picard are really new characters in New Trek for the most part. Every time new characters are introduced, they fall flat. They're either like mediocre or terrible. And so Shaw and Jack stand out as good new characters. So Seven enters and says, can we talk? And Shaw says, officially, no. And then she says, unofficially, and he says no. Just his deadpan delivery. I love Shaw. I think Shaw is a great character. And Seven asks for Shaw's help to find the changeling, lets him know the changeling is on board and has been on board since before Picard and Riker boarded. Shaw knows the ship better than anyone, so that's the reason Seven is going to him. And then cutting back to Picard, he takes Jack to the Earth bar, the 10 forward on Earth. I hate that. 10 forward is a spot on the ship. That's why it was called 10 forward. So I don't like this. This was introduced in the second season of Picard, the 10 forward bar on Earth, and they used a lot, obviously, here. I guess that's probably because they didn't have the money to use other sets. But regardless, I'm not really a big fan of it, but it doesn't really matter because the core of the character interactions negate how dumb 10 forward Earth bar is. But Jack says, he's not a wine guy. Picard tries to give him some of his wine, and Jack says, I just like cheap whiskey on the rocks. And I'm right there with you, Jack. I'm definitely a fan of cheap whiskey on the rocks. But when they walk onto the holodeck, I was thinking, my Star Trek brain was like, wait a minute, they don't have any power. They barely have power for life support. How are they using the holodeck right here? But they actually address it in the episode. They actually address it almost immediately because Jack's like, how come the power is working here when we're running out of power? And Picard says it relies on a small independent power cell, so it can act as a sanctuary in times of distress. And I was like, you know what? That actually kind of makes sense. And it's nice that they actually address it, because this is the kind of thing Star Trek fans think about. You're like, well, wait a minute. If they don't have power, why is this working? Like, these are things that when Star Trek fans are watching a Star Trek show, like, you have to explain some technical reasons for things to be what they are. And that's what gives weight to the universe and gives weight to what's happening and gets people invested in what's happening. And it's nice that they actually address that. And during this conversation, Jack asks about the hair. He's like, the elephant in the room, the hair. And when did that go? When did you lose your hair? And, Picard's like, you're what, 24? 23, 24? Enjoy it while you can. And I think that's so funny because, I started going bald when I was like 24, 25. So I thought that was so funny. And ultimately, the interactions between Picard and Jack are the most impactful in this episode. They're some of the best stuff. That's the thing about this entire season so far. And every episode has had great character moments, great dialogue. So back with Shaw, he is explaining to Seven about changelings because Seven's never actually encountered them because the Dominion War happened when the Voyager was in the Delta Quadrant. And Shaw uses a compliment to Seven to showcase, hey, this is something a changeling might say, acting out of the ordinary, just as an example. And it's just kind of funny the way Shaw delivers it. And, he says, changelings are almost impossible to catch, on a ship. And honestly, changelings are almost impossible to catch on a ship. There's a whole episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine dealing with that problem. And that was on the Defiant, a ship that's much smaller. And so the idea of them being able to catch the changeling, here's the reason that they give in the episode. Is Shaw recommends finding the changeling's pot, which is a reference to Odo, and we actually see Odo's face on a pad. But changelings, we never see any changeling outside of Odo use a pot, and even Odo himself throughout Deep Space Nine, he stops using the pot. He even talks about the fact that he views the pot as almost like a crib, kind of, because he doesn't need it anymore.
I don't use the bucket anymore. I've kept it to remind me of how I used to be.
So changelings don't necessarily need a pot. So I just thought that was kind of weird. Again, this is like me as a Star Trek fan thinking about it and being familiar with Deep Space Nine. I'm like, yeah, he doesn't really use a pot. So we never see any other changelings use one, but okay, sure. So Shaw's recommendation is that if she can find this pot, then the computer can scan the goo residue that's left over from when the changeling was in it, and then use the ship sensors to track down the changeling. And it is entirely possible, it's been 20 plus years since the Dominion War, that they have upgraded tech specifically to search for changelings. That's entirely possible. So that'll be the reason in my headcanon. They don't actually explain it. That's my reasoning in my headcanon as to why this is even a thing, because obviously during the Dominion War they had no tech to be able to track down the changelings, and that was why they were so dangerous. And Seven does search through the changeling's quarters that the changeling was staying in, and does find the pot. Apparently this changeling is using a pot. And back on the Shrike is hanging out outside of the anomaly, I guess waiting to see if the Titan comes out or not. And, then we get a big reveal where it's revealed Vadic is actually a changeling, and she cuts her hand off, and then there's a floating Zordon head that comes out of it and starts talking to her. And whatever the Zordon is, this Zordon head is telling Vadic, you have to go pursue. I don't really care what happens to you or the ship. It doesn't matter. The most important thing is to get Jack. So Vadic's like, okay, well, I don't really have a choice. And, but they can't. The whole reason why they didn't follow the Titan in the first place is that the portal tech they were using in the previous episode, it kept them from going into the anomaly because of the gravity well at the center of the anomaly. It would destroy the ship because of the portal tech they had on it. So they jettisoned the portal tech. And again, this is what I was talking about. It's honestly nice to see these kinds of technical reasons explained in the episode, because that's a big part of Star Trek. Again, that's what gives it weight. There's an explanation as to why the Shrike didn't follow them in. It's perfectly reasonable. Plus, it's a way to explain the portal tech away, so you actually have the Titan have a chance against the Shrike. Because with that portal tech, the Titan had zero chance. Then we jump back to the flashback, which is obviously 5 years ago. The cadets are listening to Picard's stories, and he talks about the episode of Darmok, which is an infamous episode of Star Trek TNG and one of the better episodes of TNG. So that's nice. But one of the cadets then asks about the Jack Crusher story and a navigational problem that Picard and Jack Crusher had run into. And Picard specifically calls it a no-win scenario, which is, title drop. That's what they're talking about. So it cuts from the no-win scenario to back to the present, and some of the crew are taking shelter in the holodeck with Jack and Picard. And Jack says, if you think this is a moment that I need, I don't need it. I'm fine on my own. And Picard says, well, maybe you don't need it, but maybe I do. And again, these interactions work really well. A lot of good character moments in this episode. And then we come back to Seven, who is walking down the corridors with a pot when the changeling attacks her and destroys the pot, apparently preventing her from being able to scan and find the changeling. And Seven does fire back, but the changeling escapes into the ducts. And Picard tells Jack about he and Jack Crusher's no-win scenario that there was referenced into the flashback. And he does drop the F-bomb here. I'm not a fan of this. I did read that this was an ad-lib from Patrick Stewart. I don't like cursing in Star Trek. I just don't. I don't think this necessarily takes away from what's happening because of in the way it was used. I'm just not really a fan of it personally. But after Picard tells Jack the story, you know, Picard asked if Beverly might have already told him if he knew it, and Jack's about to answer with that, but is interrupted by Shaw, who is he says that he's hopped up on some pain meds. Then we find out Shaw was at the Battle of Wolf 359, which is something that I said in my review of the first episode, just because of how he was referring to the Borg. He specifically mentioned Locutus. He didn't like Seven using their name. So obviously he had some history with the Borg and Picard, which really narrows it down to Wolf 359, and we find out that he has survivor's guilt from that battle. And there's even a dig on Picard season 2 where he says, you know, forget about all that weird shit with the Stargazer. The real Borg are still out there. And I thought that was great. I just love the little things that kind of take the dumbest aspects of Picard season 1 and 2 and just like push them aside. Like, just forget about that. We're not going to address that. Just put that over there. We'll put it in the bad ideas pile, and hopefully everybody just kind of forgets. And Shaw says the only Borg out there that is so deadly they gave him a name, Locutus of Borg. And, you know, Picard walks out, and Jack follows him. And Shaw looks around at his crew after this outburst, and he says, forgive me, at some point, asshole became a substitute for charm. And yeah, I like Shaw. There are some aspects of him that are not a standard Starfleet captain, obviously. Not just because of the way he speaks, but just the way he kind of acts. But he's interesting. And I like that. So Crusher tells Picard and Jack that the waves that have been hitting them imply that there could be contractions, that whatever this thing is, it's maybe about to give birth, which is what Crusher was doing the countdowns with earlier. And Jack says, well, maybe they can plug into the power that's being output for when the waves are hitting them. Every time one of these waves hit them, the lights, you know, come on, which is nice because then we actually see what's happening on the bridge.
I can see, guys, I can see.
So Beverly, Picard, Jack, they try and sell Riker on a plan, but he's not really buying it. And Picard says, if this is the end, let's face it together, doing what we do best. So Riker decides, you know what, we're going to go ahead and give this a shot. So Seven and Picard go to Shaw because they need his help. And again, I'm not really a fan of the cursing in Trek. However, this specific line I think does work in the context because, you know, Picard says, you know, hey, we need you even though you are a dipshit from Chicago, referencing back to what Shaw called himself whenever he was recounting his story of Wolf 359, where he says, I don't know why they picked me. I'm just some dipshit from Chicago. And Picard saying that line back to him, like, it gets Shaw's respect because Shaw he's the type of person that if you speak to him on his level, like, he appreciates it and respects it. And he's not just some, like, bad guy or some, you know, a-hole or whatever, or a dipshit. Like, he's interesting. He's an interesting character. But Shaw is the only one who's trained to work on the older nacelles because none of the newer crewmen had ever worked on them because all the nacelles are over 20 years old. And then Riker gives the con to Picard since he has the most experience flying blind, as referenced by the story. And then we get the TNG music playing as Picard takes the con and says engage, and I like that scene. I liked it. But as Shaw and Seven are working on trying to open the nacelles, Ensign LaForge walks in, but they suss her out pretty fast because they had already contacted Riker earlier and said, hey, don't send any help because if somebody shows up, we're going to assume it's the changeling. Which you don't actually see that scene, but it is referenced as to, you know, why they already suspected as soon as, you know, LaForge just showed up. And Seven confirms that this is probably the changeling by asking Ensign LaForge what her name is. And the changeling says Commander Hansen, and, you know, Seven takes out the changeling. And, obviously Ensign LaForge, as we saw in the previous episode, called her Commander 7 because she respects her. So it's just nice to see these little character moments, these little character interactions do lead to something. They do mean something, even carrying over to the next episode. And there's some conclusion there, and I really like it. I will say, me personally, as a big fan of DS9, the way the changelings are portrayed in this season, there's something off about them, and maybe it's explained, but they do not seem like standard changelings. Changelings are very tricky, and they can be anything. Not only can they be anyone, but they can also be anything. There were so many different ways for this changeling to take out Seven and Shaw if they wanted to. There's so many different things they could transform into or change into. But yeah, I don't know. We'll wait and see. We'll wait and see if it's explained. But right now, I definitely have some questions as to the way these changelings are portrayed in comparison to how they were portrayed in Deep Space Nine.
I don't get it.
And Picard, with Jack's help, does navigate the asteroids, and every power from life support is pulled out so that they can catch the wave and ride it out of the anomaly. And as they are doing that, it recharges the power through their nacelles to kickstart their warp core. But the Shrike is in their way as they're riding the wave out. And Riker tractor beams an asteroid and throws it at the Shrike as they ride out of the wave. And it takes out the Shrike's warp core, so the Shrike cannot follow. And Riker literally threw an asteroid at the Shrike. And then we get the music swelling as the anomaly gives birth to a bunch of space jellyfish. And, the crew looks on in awe, and it reminds us, hey, this is a Star Trek show, too. Like, this is what Star Trek's about, discovering new life and new civilizations. And Crusher even says that specific line. She just says to seek out new life. And that's what Star Trek has been missing, is aspects like this, the discovery aspects, not the discovery of the show, because that's not Star Trek, in my opinion. The discovery of new life. That's Star Trek to me. Then we cut back to the flashback, and we hear Picard say to the young cadets, "Your crew become a part of you. They complete you. They lift you up to accomplish the things you could never have done alone." And it turns out Jack was in the bar listening to all this 5 years ago, and he asked if Picard ever had a real family. And he responds, "Well, Starfleet is the only family I've ever needed." And that's ultimately the reason why Jack decided not to pursue a relationship with his dad. That's the reason why. Is it sufficient? I don't think so. But it is a reason that he thought it was enough to not do that. And in the present, we cut back to Picard, and he seems to maybe remember this encounter now. We'll find out in the next episode if that is the case. And as I said earlier, Jack was going to tell Picard before, hey, actually, I do know this story about you and Jack Crusher because I was in the bar that day 5 years ago. So it's nice just to see these little things tie in. I mean, it's good writing. It's good dialogue. I mean, just compare the quality of the writing in this season to previous seasons. It's insane, the leap in quality. I mean, I understand some people still don't like this season. They still don't like how dark it is and aspects like that, but just from the quality of the writing, it's not even close. Riker gets Troy on comms, and Riker says, something is different now. There are no words to describe how he feels right now and how he's changed. It's as if, I viewed this as Riker basically having a spiritual awakening in some kind of way. Like, he becomes more aware or is reminded of the vastness of the universe and the things that you don't understand. And instead of looking at it as an abyss, it's just this wide open, frontier of things that you don't really know. It's a form of spiritual awakening, and I kind of like this. Card gives a Starfleet log, and I thought that was pretty cool. And then we get cut back to Jack, who is envisioning the red clouds and the red vines and the destruction, the visions that he was having in the last episode are back. And the episode closes with somebody, it seems like a female voice, saying, "Find me." So that is the mystery. And I don't typically like mystery boxes, and I don't typically like long form storytelling in Star Trek. I think Star Trek is an episodic franchise, personally. However, that doesn't mean long-form storytelling can't work, and it doesn't mean mystery boxes it can't work. It's all in how they are handled. In order to have mystery boxes, function and for people to buy into them, you actually have to give answers as those mysteries are being put out there. And I think they're doing a good job of answering things as we're walking through, as we're watching the season. And in regards to long form storytelling, I think it works in this season in particular, mainly because I'm viewing this as a movie. I'm not really viewing this as a show. Like, this is almost like a mini series, Star Trek event. That's how I view it, and that's why I think it's working on that level. And ultimately, I just think the writing here just leaps and bounds better than anything I've seen from New Trek. And, I think it's working. I'm looking forward to the next episode. Each episode, I do think, is kind of building on one another and definitely building a little bit of more hype for me in particular anyway. I want to see episode 5. I'm like, okay. Also, I want to remind you, Rafi was not in this episode. So even though this episode was very character focused, very character heavy, with the character interactions, we never had a problem with the pacing because we never had to cut back to Rafi. That was the worst part of the first few episodes, was every time I cut back to Rafi, the pacing would take a hit, and Rafi is the worst.
She's the worst in the world.
Of course, next episode, we're probably going to cut back to Rafi, but on the upside, at least Worf is there, so that'll help us deal with it a little bit more. But what did you guys think about this episode, and what did you guys think about this season so far? Are you looking forward to episode 5? And let me know what you guys think about episode 4. Did you like some of the character interactions like I did? Regardless, I'm looking forward to the next episode. I'll try and get my review up a little bit earlier. Comment and let me know if you guys would rather me do shorter reviews that I might be able to get up faster, or if you like the review style that I'm currently using, even though it results in me being a few days late. Very interested to hear your opinions on that as well. I just want to thank everybody for joining me today. Thank you, subscribers. All of you are awesome. And if you like this video, please like, comment, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff, or don't. I'm not a beggar. I'm HeTrue64, and I'll always tell you the truth.